War is unpredictable by its nature. No one would have expected a dispute over the suzerainty of Gascony to erupt into a 100-year war between France and England, or a Protestant revolt in Bohemia to cause 30 years of religious war in Germany. The unpredictability of war is, however, a two-way street. If some spiral into years of bloodshed, others are resolved in a matter of weeks, days, hours, or in the case of history's shortest war, a matter of minutes. That war, the Anglo-Zanzibar War, lasted a mere 38 minutes. Fought in 1896 between the Sultanate of Zanzibar and the British Empire at its imperial zenith, the war was a decidedly one-sided affair. In the time it would take you to eat lunch, the Royal Navy engaged in a devastating bombardment which left hundreds dead and the Sultan of Zanzibar effectively deposed. Let's take a step back for a second. To understand the events that led to the Anglo-Zanzibar War, it is crucial to briefly explore the history of Zanzibar. The island of Zanzibar, located in the Indian Ocean off East Africa, is blessed by geography with rich soils and natural ports. Since the arrival of Arab merchants around the 8th century, the island has been a key hub in Indian Ocean trade. Consequently, the island had been contested by Indian Ocean naval powers for centuries, falling under the control of the Portuguese in 1499 and later Oman in 1698. By the turn of the 19th century, Zanzibar was home to vast clove plantations, represented the largest hub in the ivory trade, and was exporting as many as 60,000 slaves a year. To support this vast demand for slaves, Zanzibar had established forts and settlements across the African coastline, from which it combed the vast African hinterlands for slaves. As Britain expanded its overseas empire in the early 19th century, its interest in Zanzibar naturally followed. Zanzibar was ideally situated along the route from Britain to its vast Indian holdings. Therefore, when the Sultan Sayyid Majid of Zanzibar declared independence from Oman in 1858, Britain formally guaranteed Zanzibar's independence. However, that newfound independence was short-lived. Over the following decades, it was steadily eroded by the twin forces of abolitionism and imperialism. Though it may seem paradoxical to the 21st century mind, the eradication of slavery and imperial expansion were intertwined under the banner of the civilizing mission. In 1873, a British ultimatum forced the Sultanate to abolish the slave trade. However, Zanzibari slave catchers continued their operations, giving Britain and the newly unified German Empire a pretext to demand territorial concessions along the African coastline in 1886. While both nations took measures to dismantle the slave trade in these regions, their acquisitions also served as strategic footholds for further expansion into East Africa. Finally, in 1890, an Anglo-German treaty resolved their competing claims on the Zanzibari archipelago in Britain's favor, allowing Britain to formally demand that Zanzibar become a protectorate. From that point forward, Britain gained direct representation in Zanzibar's government and, crucially, the power to veto the succession and appointment of all future sultans. Britain's grip on Zanzibar appeared secure. British ministers were elected in a new government and gradually reformed the Sultanate in line with British values. And in 1893, the British secured the succession of the Anglophile Sultan Hamid bin Twain. Under the surface, however, cracks began to show. The Sultan's courtiers resented the British ministers who had undermined their influence, and wealthy slavers saw their fortunes wrecked by the British suppression of the slave trade. For their part, the British resented the continued practice of slavery on Zanzibar, which, despite the ban on the slave trade, remained legal and widespread across the Sultanate. The trouble began at 11:40 a.m. on August 25, 1896, when Sultan Hamid bin Twain died under suspicious circumstances. Within 20 minutes of the Sultan's death, his cousin, Khalid bin Bargash, occupied the royal palace with 1,200 soldiers. Whether Khalid assassinated his cousin remains unclear, but his decisive actions in the immediate aftermath suggest that his royal coup was premeditated. The British reacted quickly to Khalid's seizure of power. At 11:50 a.m., as Khalid's men were streaming into the palace, resident consul Basil Cave and British General Lloyd Matthews pleaded with Khalid to stand down and await British arbitration. When their efforts to negotiate with Khalid were rebuffed, the two men organized the evacuation of British nationals to the consulate and sent word to London about the brewing crisis. To the good fortune of the British, two ships of the Royal Navy, the cruiser Philomo and gunboat Thrush, were anchored in Zanzibar's harbor, and another gunboat, the Sparrow, was stationed in the immediate vicinity of Zanzibar town. Additionally, 900 Zanzibari soldiers loyal to the British marched to the consulate's aid. At 3 p.m., cannons were heard from the royal palace, marking Khalid's accession to the throne. In violation of the 1890 treaty, the new Sultan was now in open rebellion against the British Empire. As the British awaited reinforcements and word from London, and Khalid attempted to consolidate his position, the night of the 25th passed in uneasy peace. On the 26th of August, the situation swung ever more in Britain's favor. While Khalid's forces had swelled to 3,000 soldiers and armed retainers, and had taken possession of the antiquated frigate HHS Glasgow, the British were reinforced first by the torpedo cruiser Raccoon and later the flagship cruiser St. George. With the arrival of reinforcements, word was received from London giving the British forces carte blanche to resolve the crisis. That afternoon, the British sent Khalid an ultimatum: vacate the palace by 9 the following morning or face the wrath of the Royal Navy. On the morning of the 27th, with no word from Khalid, the Royal Navy took up battle positions. The gunboats Raccoon, Thrush, and Sparrow were positioned within firing range of the palace, while the heavier cruisers, Philomo and St. George, took up supportive positions. At 8 a.m., just 1 hour before the ultimatum was set to expire, Khalid broke his silence, sending an envoy to Consul Basil Cave. However, hopes of a peaceful resolution to the crisis were dashed when Khalid's envoy made clear that the Sultan had no intention of surrendering the palace. As the clock struck 9, an eerie silence gripped Zanzibar town. The British ultimatum had expired, yet the Sultan's flag still flew defiantly over the palace. If the Sultan believed for a few short moments that the British ultimatum had been a bluff, his hopes were soon to be shattered. At 9:02 a.m., the Raccoon, Thrush, and Sparrow unleashed a simultaneous volley of fire upon the palace. The palace, constructed of wood and hastily barricaded over the past 2 days, proved to be a better coffin than fortress. Nevertheless, as the palace caught fire and collapsed around them, the Zanzibari soldiers put up a dogged resistance. With antiquated artillery and even rifles, the Zanzibari soldiers returned fire upon the British. However, valor alone was no substitute for modern weapons. As Zanzibari cannonballs and rifle rounds bounced impotently off heavy British hulls, the British naval guns quickly neutralized their positions. In their valiant effort to return fire at the Royal Navy, the Zanzibari artillerymen only managed to inflict one non-fatal casualty. While the British gunboats battered the palace into dust, Zanzibar's sole frigate, the Glasgow, engaged the St. George, unleashing her 7 9-pounder guns on the state-of-the-art British flagship. the Glasgow was unable to inflict any real damage. When the Flumel and the St. George returned fire, she too quickly sunk. Fortunately, the timely arrival of the St. George's lifeboats ensured the survival of the entire crew of the Glasgow. At 9:15 a.m., two unarmed Zanzibari steamships packed with riflemen raced towards the Thrush. With suicidal bravery, the riflemen fired round after round at the Thrush until their steamboats too were sunk. In 13 minutes of fighting, the British had neutralized most of the Pallas's artillery and Zanzibar's sole frigate. Nevertheless, whether out of desperate courage or general confusion, the Sultan's soldiers continued to fight. Over the following 25 minutes, the British gunboats continued to bombard the now helpless soldiers defending the palace, and British land forces surrounded the fortress. The firing stopped at 9:40 a.m. when the Sultan's flag was cut down by a stray shot. If the ceasefire had been called on mistaken premises, however, the palace defenders were nonetheless eager to see an end to the one-sided battle. 500 of the Sultan's soldiers, retainers, and servants lost their lives as a result of British bombardment and the fires which subsequently engulfed the palace. Ironically, while the Sultan's soldiers endured 38 minutes of devastating bombardment, Khalid had fled the palace and abandoned his followers immediately upon the sound of British fire. Sneaking past the British ground forces, Khalid took refuge in the German consulate. Despite British demands of extradition, the Germans recognized Khalid's political value and granted the former Sultan asylum in German East Africa. After the palace fell, British forces occupied Zanzibar town to restore order. That afternoon, the British installed Hamoud bin Mohammed as the new Sultan. From this point onwards, however, the Sultan would serve as little more than a figurehead, while real power was held by a series of British advisors appointed by the Colonial Office. With British rule over Zanzibar cemented, all forms of slavery were officially abolished across the Sultanate. After a decades-long diplomatic effort to chip away at the institution of slavery in the Sultanate, the war had finally given British abolitionists the opportunity they had craved to end it once and for all. Khalid bin Bargash, having successfully fled to German East Africa, would spend the next 2 decades in luxury. However, if the Sultan for 2 days believed he had eluded the British, he was in for a rude awakening. In 1917, as the world was gripped by the Great War, Khalid was finally captured by the British. It seems his cowardice had finally caught up to him. Thank you all for watching my video on the Anglo-Zanzibar War. I know I've been on a long hiatus, and it's good to be back making videos. Please let me know your thoughts on this war below. Is it more significant than just being history's shortest war? I personally think so, and you've seen my reasons throughout this video. Again, I hope you enjoyed it, and please like and subscribe to motivate me to make more of these.